Welcome for a webinar at the U.S. Studies Center on the discussion of trade tensions and economic coercion. What is next for the U.S.-China-Australia relationship? My name is Charles Edel, and I'm a senior fellow here at the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and culture. The University of Sydney stands on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you, all of you, for joining us for such an incredibly timely and hopefully quite useful discussion on economic coercion. Now, over the past month, the question of what has been going on between Australia and China is the first and sometimes the only question dominating the media cycle here in Australia. For those of you not across the details, in late April, the Chinese ambassador to Australia stated in an interview that, quote, "The Chinese people are frustrated, dismayed, and disappointed with Australia and what it's doing," and suggested that Chinese tourists and Chinese students may have second thoughts about traveling to, quote, "such a country that is not so friendly to China." Now, although these comments came in response to Australia's call for an independent investigation into the source of the coronavirus pandemic, these type of threats are not new. Moreover, they were followed by moves to limit China's imports of Australian beef, barley, and possibly coal. Australia is not alone in having its exports threatened by the Chinese government. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Norway, and others have all had their trade with China disrupted after making political decisions that angered Beijing. Late last year, China's ambassador to Denmark threatened a free trade agreement if they refused to sign a 5G contract with Huawei. In Germany, China's ambassador stated that if Germany decided to, quote, "exclude Huawei, this will have consequences. You sell 1 million cars per year in China. We may also declare them unsafe." Earlier this year, the Chinese embassy in Prague warned the Czech president's office of retaliation against Czech companies if a senior lawmaker visited Taiwan, writing, quote, "that Czech companies who have economic interests in China will have to pay." And just earlier this week, China Daily, which is overseen by the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda department, ran an editorial with the headline, "UK will pay price if it carries out decision to exclude Huawei from its 5G network." So much for the subtlety. Now, prominent Australian commentators have observed that Beijing's actions have revealed the true nature of the Chinese government. And there's been much discussion about why China is targeting Australia in this way. But the examples I just laid out should underscore the point that Australia is not alone in facing coercive economic pressure from China, even if the suddenness and intensity of Beijing's recent actions have caught many by surprise. Keeping the conversation focused on just what's happening in Australia misses the broader context of what China is doing globally and how increasing pressure on Australia fits into and draws from that playbook. Moreover, by staying focused only what Australia should or should not do, the conversation is missing a great opportunity to draw on how other countries are responding and what has been effective. Now, the intent of this webinar is to broaden the conversation to understand the pattern of Chinese behavior around the world and the tools which have been effective and those of which have been counterproductive in responding. To explore these questions, I'm thrilled to welcome you all to a discussion featuring my U.S. Studies Center colleague, John Lee, and the authors of a new report, A New Arsenal for Competition, Coercive Measures in the U.S.-China Relationship, Liz Rosenberg, Ashley Feng, and Peter Harrell of the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. It's hard to think of a better group of folks to discuss this important and quite timely subject. Before we get going, I'm going to give you a brief bio so you know who you're going to be listening to. Liz Rosenberg is a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Economics, and Security program at the Center for New American Security. In that capacity, she publishes and speaks on the national security and foreign policy implications of the use of sanctions and economic statecraft, as well as energy market shifts. From 2009 to 2013, Liz served as senior advisor to the U.S. Department of Treasury, to the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and then to the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Ashley Feng is a research associate for the Energy, Economics, and Security program at CNAS. Her research focus includes U.S.-China trade relations, China's economic policies, and China's global economic footprint. Her work and commentary have appeared in NPR, CNBC, Foreign Policy, Fortune, Scientific America, and The National Interest. Peter Harrell is an adjunct senior fellow at CNES, where he focuses on the intersection of economics and national security. From 2012 to 2014, Peter served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counter Threat Finance and Sanctions in the State Department's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. In that role, he was instrumental in developing the international sanctions against Iran, Russia, and Syria, and easing the use of US sanctions against Myanmar. Finally, my colleague, Dr. John Lee, is a senior fellow at the US Studies Center. He is also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. From 2016 to 2018, he was a senior advisor to the Australian Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop. He's the author of numerous studies and reports, including the recently published US Studies Center report, US-China Economic Distancing in the Era of Great Power, Rivalry, and COVID-19, and together with me, The Future of US-Australian Alliance in an Era of Great Power Competition. Now, before we begin, a couple of quick administrative matters. We'll have each of our panelists speak about their work, defining what coercive diplomacy is, explaining how China's arsenal of coercive economic tools is expanding, discussing the evolution of the US policy response, and explaining what this all means to and for Australia. After each of our panelists lay out their initial thoughts, we'll have a conversation among the panelists before opening it up to all of you and your questions. I promise I'll do my best to get through as many of those questions as possible, and I would like to ask all of you watching, if you decide to type a question in, please limit your question on commentary so that I can make sure that I can read through this while I'm listening to everyone else as well. So first, let me turn it over to Liz for an overview of their project, what it was trying to track, how you went about the research, and maybe first off, a definition of economic coercion. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to participate with all of you for this conversation today. This is indeed about a topic that we have been keenly interested in for a number of years now, and have been very eager to talk about, not just with Americans, who we work with so closely on a daily basis, of course. We are based in Washington, but with people elsewhere in the world who have also been observing the phenomenon that you spoke about, Charlie, at the beginning, and as it affects them at home, as it affects partners and allies of theirs, and in trying to understand how, for example, a strategic competition between the United States and China will influence the choices, leverage, and opportunities for countries all over the world. So I have spoken about this with Australian diplomats and experts, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation today for being able to talk about this with you all. So with that said, let me begin by offering to you the working definition we have for economic coercion, recognizing that different people have used variations on this, and a rich discussion is useful for trying to get at what it means and why it's significant. So we have called economic coercion restrictions on trade, investment, and financial flows to impose economic costs on a target in pursuit of a strategic objective, to try and influence a foreign government, a group, an individual, to offer policy concessions, or to specifically to shape their political choices, their policy options. And we first started with that working definition several years ago when we wrote a report on Chinese economic coercion. And in it, we did a number of case studies. We reviewed a number of case studies. In fact, some that you just mentioned, Charlie, in your opening. And actually, I think towards the end of our drafting, we wanted to pull in some information related to Australia, which hadn't previously been as prominent as it became over the course of our research then. In the last couple of years, we have seen increasing instances of Chinese economic coercion, and including severity, intensity, a dialing up of the rhetoric and the threats. Again, you were getting at that in your introduction. And watched that that suite of economic coercive tools expand in the United States by the United States government. And for both countries, this has been an evolutionary process. The points of economic leverage that they both have are different. So the suite of instruments available to each country is different, but it has been an incredibly dynamic area. And because of this increasing use, because of confusion that we've observed by observers and indeed the targets of this economic coercion, we wanted to take another big crack at this. This is the genesis of our report, to do a kind of cataloging of what the instruments of economic coercion are, and make a comment on the effectiveness. And part of the reason for this is to explain to people, if you will, a kind of proportionality, or make a comment on severity, who the target set appears to be, or what the objectives, the changing objectives are, the sort of expanding scope of national security being the underlying objective for both China and the United States, and how they deploy these. And over the last couple of years, we've also been watching how China and the United States have used these instruments more toward one another, and changing the character of the bilateral competition, which has clear and sometimes very material impacts on a huge range of other countries, partners, allies. So Peter and Ashley are both going to talk a little bit more about what some of these, the modalities and the instruments of coercion, economic coercion, are that we were cataloging in this report. So I'm not going to go too much into that. I will just also offer a point on the methodology that we used for this report. It was our pleasure and a great opportunity to talk to government experts, independent experts, academics in Australia, in Europe, elsewhere in Asia, through travel and structured interviews, through meetings that we held. And in many instances, they were really eye-opening to us about the level of threat that many US allies feel from not just China, which we were prepared for and had been thinking of in our research, but to also hear a number of them articulate the even parallel threat or risk that they have felt from the United States. And here I'm still talking about, allies and partners, treaty allies of the United States. And so it became yet another reason for us to want to dig in really deeply on this topic in order to try and inform, as a primary audience for this, US policymakers and influential thinkers to the US policymaking process about what the impacts are of this use of the set of economic coercive instruments by China and the United States, in order to try and guide where the United States may go with its use of these tools, and in thinking about resiliency and working with partners and allies in meeting and dealing with Chinese use of coercive economic measures. It seemed like a timely project when we started. It felt more and more and more so all the way along, and we are continuing with a follow-on research project now that also feels incredibly timely, particularly just in the events of this past week or this past 24-hour news cycle for us. So let me stop there with this introduction, and I'm happy to talk about any portion of that in the discussion later.
Terrific. Thanks, Liz. You've given us an awful lot of info, even just to kick things off. And I really do hope that we can dig into not only, as you said, the catalog of new tools that have come online, but also which ones have proved more effective or less effective. But Ashley, I'd like to go to you next as the lead author on the section of the report about Chinese economic coercion. And I was hoping you might be able to walk us through how Beijing thinks about the subject. What, if anything, has been changing in the Chinese government's approach over the recent past? Why do they even use these tools in the first place? And what should we expect moving forward? Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks so much for having me on, Charlie. So I'm going to take your second question first, which is, where does coercive economic measures kind of fit into China's larger toolkit? So as Song Guoyu, who is a scholar that's affiliated with the Ministry of Commerce in China, put it, coercive economic measures are the best option between subtle diplomacy and all-out war. So this makes it one of the most valuable tools in China's toolkit and in the CCP's toolkit. So there has been a change in use of China's economic statecraft, otherwise known as Jingji Waijiao, over the past couple of decades. So you started in 1978 with Deng Xiaoping and the going out strategy. In the 90s, you then moved to 以经促进, which is improving political relations through economic cooperation. And then you kind of get to where we are now, in which China has become much more aggressive, especially over the past few years, in its use of coercive economic measures. It's increased in its frequency of deployment of these measures, and it's also become a lot less subtle. So coercive economic measures in Chinese is 经济策法, and they see it as a tool that large countries use. So as China has becoming a much larger country on the global stage, this also, the idea of using coercive economic measures also becomes, to them, it seems more natural. When they say big countries like to use coercive economic measures, they're usually referring to the United States, but as they become one of these big countries, it's also natural that China also sees themselves as being able to use these tools as well. So over the past couple of years, we've seen both an expansion in the objectives, as well as the tools that China has been trying to use to achieve its national security and foreign policy goals. So in expanding objectives, you have the expansion of economic advantages. So for example, domestically, China recently passed a domestic foreign investment law in which it said that it wanted to harmonize domestic foreign investment into China along with economic security. And you also see an uptick in economic espionage, especially cyber economic espionage from Chinese actors for the necessary high-tech tools that they want. Secondly, you see China responding to infringement on territorial integrity. And you've seen this especially over the past couple of years with Hong Kong and Taiwan. So when the Hong Kong protests broke out and you had individual foreign companies that were based in Hong Kong, employees who were posting on their own personal social media expressing support for the Hong Kong protesters, China essentially pressured some large financial institutions there to take measures to make sure that they weren't actually expressing support for these protesters in the first place. And as the issue of Taiwan also gets a lot more hotly contested over the past couple of months, you're also seeing this. You had, to take an example from the Asia Pacific region, you saw an Air New Zealand plane taking off and trying to land in China, but because there was something in the crew manifest that basically said that Taiwan was not part of China, they then had that airplane turn back around and land back in New Zealand. Thirdly, you see China taking a more aggressive approach to defend its own national champions. So you use the example of Huawei. And Huawei isn't just an isolated incident in Europe, in the United States, but also in Australia as well. And that kind of gets to the fourth expansion in its objectives, which is targeting US alliances and allies, as Liz was talking about. So you see China increasingly also attack US allies and partners such as Canada for actions that the United States is taking against China. But because China doesn't want to directly retaliate against the United States, they take it out against allies and partners. And this is kind of where third countries get caught up in this also escalating competition between the United States and China. Finally, on the expansion of tools that China has been codifying over the past couple of years, so Liz talked about some of the previous tools that China has been using, such as import and export restrictions, popular boycotts, investment restrictions, pressure on specific companies, restrictions on Chinese tourism and students, as well as targeted financial measures. China is also crafting new tools and modalities within its own legal and regulatory system. So primarily against the United States, you've seen tariffs become this key tool that China has also used over the past couple of years. Although ironically, as China has been increasing pressure on the tariff side against the United States, it's also been lowering its tariff barriers towards the rest of the world. You also saw the development of the corporate social credit system, as well as the unreliable entities list. You also see China using law enforcement more regularly, such as the Civil Aviation Association of China. That's actually become a really interesting case study to see how China has deployed the CAAC to enforce a lot of its hardline policies against Taiwan. And finally, you see the removal of foreign products, and this kind of gets to this larger question of decoupling, in which China has now also decided that all government computers must not contain any foreign hardware within any government buildings. So where do we see China going over the next couple of years? I think we've seen, and we are going to continue seeing, an increasingly emboldened China. And the lack of coordinated response against China from the United States and allies such as Australia, and along with the trend of China becoming increasingly aggressive in general, as Xi Jinping has come to power, all of this will just lead China to become even more emboldened and even more aggressive in the next few years. Now I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thanks, Ashley. Lots, again, to chew on there. You went through a ton of stuff. I would just note two things which we're going to return to. So I'm flagging this for you and the rest of the panelists. One, it's interesting that you laid out when we hear about decoupling, we always hear about the US possibly decoupling or diversifying away from China. What Ashley's laid out, which is I think really helpful, is that it was an internal Chinese decision to decouple itself in certain sectors from the US economy that preceded that. The second thing, just from a strategic point of view, Ashley, you had noted the expanding use of tools and the expanding set of objectives. And this is what we call a chicken and an egg problem. Which precedes which? Do your objectives grow when you have more resources, or once you have more resources, do you have the ability to pursue things that you couldn't previously? I'm flagging that because we're going to come back to that. But in the meantime, let's flip it over fully to the US side. And Peter, love to get your thoughts on the American policy response. How has the US responded? What's new and different? What's been effective? What's been counterproductive? And what methods are perhaps unclear as of now in their effectiveness? It's too early to tell. Let me turn it over to you for some of those.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. I appreciate you having me join the panel, and thanks to all of you attending the panel. I was actually mostly going to talk about some of the U.S. measures, coercive economic measures that the U.S. has deployed against China. Obviously, a particularly hot topic today as we get into the decertification of Hong Kong under U.S. law as separate from China, and we can talk some about what that means. But I think before talking briefly about U.S. coercive economic measures against China, I'd like to actually more narrowly answer your question about the U.S. response to China's use of coercive economic measures against both the United States and allies. And I think on that narrow question of how has the U.S. responded to China's use of coercive economic measures over the last couple of years, you've really seen a pretty haphazard response out of the current administration in Washington. So to give one example that directly affected U.S. companies, if you may recall, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, China began insisting that airlines serving the Chinese mainland market stop identifying Taiwan as a separate country on their websites for selling tickets. And the U.S. criticized that policy kind of at an upper level, but not at a secretarial, cabinet level or presidential level. So you saw some rhetorical opposition, but nothing really concrete. And at the end of the day, even the U.S. airlines caved to China on that. More recently, something that caught a lot of attention in the U.S. when China suspended broadcasts of certain U.S. basketball games in China because of an event in which a prominent basketball team manager spoke out against Chinese repression. They suspended NBA games, broadcast of NBA games in China. There was a lot of kind of public angst in the U.S. about that, but not a lot of concrete action out of the U.S. government. And I think that actually, frankly, has been typical of what we've seen of the U.S. response to Chinese economic coercion, where the responses to date have been pretty haphazard, irregular, and I hate to say somewhat ineffective at deterring future Chinese coercion. And I think, frankly, that's one reason why we are seeing China engaging in more and more economic coercion of its own. It's not sensing a very tough degree of resolve out of other major powers today. So let me bracket that and offer a couple of minutes on the kind of primary thing I wanted to talk about, which is the growing use of U.S. economic coercion against China, where we have seen quite a lot of work over the last couple of years. And as we have seen from the Chinese side, both an increase in the volume and type of measures deployed against China, and also an increase in the policy goals these measures are intended to serve. And in our report, we publish a lengthy chart that identifies 16 or 18 different kinds of U.S. coercive economic measures that have in recent years been deployed against China. And I'm not going to go through them exhaustively. But I break down a couple of the major categories. The first of these being obviously the Trump administration tariffs on China. The Trump administration has imposed 20% tariffs on about 3/4 of U.S. imports from China. Some $370 billion a year of imports subject to these tariffs. Very significant change from what we saw in the past, and a policy that the Trump administration is pursuing largely to try to achieve economic concessions out of China. We are also seeing a very significant increase in the U.S. use of export controls against China. This has taken the form of both targeted measures against individual Chinese firms like Huawei. The U.S., starting about a year ago, began restricting the export of U.S. products to Huawei. It's imposed similar restrictions on a whole host of other Chinese companies over the last year. And it has also taken the form of broader kind of product-based controls, where the U.S. is increasingly limiting the export of certain high-tech products to China generally. Sort of the flip side of the export controls is something that in the U.S. is called CFIUS, which is a national security review of Chinese investment in the U.S. It's been subject to much more stringent scrutiny over the last couple of years than it was prior to that. And as a result, you've seen Chinese investment in the U.S. fall by maybe 70% year on year over the last couple of years. We are also seeing increasingly more and more direct limits on imports of certain products where U.S. officials see a national security risk. Telecommunications, Huawei-made products, probably the most prominent of these. The U.S., like Australia and a number of other countries, has banned the use of Huawei equipment and telecommunications networks for national security concerns, but we're seeing more and more of this. For example, back at the beginning of May, a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. banned the import of various Chinese electrical power grid management devices, largely out of national security concerns. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And then finally, we're seeing more in the way of sanctions. A tool that has become very popular by U.S. policymakers across a whole range of issues over the last 15 years, but that frankly wasn't deployed against China very much until just the last couple of years. We are now seeing use of, actually I should say on the sanctions front is still more in the threat than in the implementation, but we are seeing the threat of sanctions around Chinese human rights abuses, including both in Xinjiang province and in Hong Kong, as well as, again, the threat of sanctions around Chinese activities in the South China Sea and a host of other cyber espionage and sort of economic and industrial espionage, whole host of areas. And again, those have mostly been threats to date, although I frankly expect, particularly with the recent action by China with respect to Hong Kong and the decertification of Hong Kong, I think we will probably see some targeted sanctions against Chinese officials, if not in the coming days, at least within the next couple of weeks. So we can come back more to what this Hong Kong action means in the Q&A. I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks very much, Peter. For Australian viewers who aren't as familiar with the CFIUS regime in the United States, Australia has its own regime. It's the FIRB regime here, the Foreign Investment Review Board, that has rethought, even in the last month and a half during the coronavirus pandemic, what level of scrutiny it wants to give to foreign investment screening at this point as more companies go into distressed state. But I don't want to talk too much about Australia because I've got the wrong accent. So I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, John, with the hope that you could walk us through what this all means for Australia, for the Australian government, for the business community, for consumers. What is Australia worried about in terms of what both China and the US are doing? And what actions is it taking now as opposed to other actions that it might be considering either on its own or potentially even in concert with others? John.
Thank you, Charles. Great to be with my CNAS colleagues, and thank you all for signing on this afternoon. I spent most of my career in American think tanks, even though being based in Australia, giving gratuitous advice to the American government, as think tankers do. For those of you who have visited Australia, or for the Australians, it's clear that we share a lot of the same concerns about China as the Americans. But I found that when I spent my 2 years in government, in advising the Turnbull government on many of these issues, my advice to the Australian government was a little different to the advice I would have been giving the people in power in Washington. And I thought in the context of the discussion today, economic coercion and so on, it might be a useful thing to point out why I think Australians think differently about strategy and economic coercion than Americans, even if we agree substantially on the problem, which is China. To be blunt, Australia faces two very confronting realities when it comes to the US-China dynamic. One, the United States is the only country China truly fears and respects. And the United States will always be more important to China than any other country. The second reality we face is that we have, as we all know, great relations with the US. We are perhaps the most trusted ally in the region, if not the world. But taking on China is Washington's main game. And the United States might see Australia as part of the solution, but it's never really going to be about us. And in a minor way, we're seeing this kind of dynamic playing out right now. Around the same time, China slapped an 80% tariff on Australian barley exports into China. The Chinese Customs Agency allowed imports of American barley for the first time. So for the United States, its eye is on making China fulfill its promises, not on the impact of Australian farmers, which is understandable. For China, its eye is on what the United States will do to it. It is smaller economies like Australia, China knows, will simply not take coercive actions against the Chinese unless in the most extreme circumstances. And for China, if they can play the US off against its allies, as they've tried to do with the barley issue to some degree, then of course Beijing is more than happy to do so. So the summary is, Australia doesn't want to be a passive bystander in all this, because we know there are a lot of important principles and practicalities at stake. But at the same time, we have to be realistic about the fact that we have very little capacity to shape the way things will actually end up. This means that for Australia, if we do things like call for an international inquiry into COVID-19, which we were one of the first, if not the first to do, it's then not about retaliating against China, it's about playing defense against anything that the Chinese might do to us. And as I mentioned, only in the most extreme circumstance would Australia contemplate playing offense when it comes to economic coercion against the Chinese. Now, with respect to collective coercive action with the United States or any other countries, let me suggest a couple of ways that our American friends could alleviate some of our anxieties, given what I've raised just now. Now, as a general rule, I think those willing to take on the risk of collective action and putting ourselves in harm's way with respect to China ought to share in the benefits. Otherwise, the incentive for a country like Australia would be to make ourselves as small a target as possible and remain on the sidelines. The US-China Phase 1 deal is essentially a G2 or Group of 2 bilateral agreement, which alleviates some American concerns rather than allied concerns. The reason why the Australians were so wholeheartedly supportive of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was because that gave us real equity in the outcome of trying to define the rules of the road in terms of greater access to the US market. We have to remember that if the United States is only selling broad principle, while China is offering guaranteed benefits, the reality is that China will win more often than not. This brings me to a second point, which is related, and that smaller countries like Australia need to know the intended institutional landing point or outcome if they are to support any coercive or countering actions against the Chinese, because institutions give power to rules and they lock in gains for smaller countries. So for example, with the whole WTO dispute, Australia is largely in agreement with a lot of American grievances, but we need to know what is the institutional outcome. Is it to compel China to reinterpret WTO obligations better? Is it to create a parallel institution to WTO regimes of which Australia could benefit from? The point I'm making is that smaller countries like Australia, they cannot afford to play a never-ending game of chicken with large powers like China. They cannot even really afford to play a game of poker with China when we don't even know what the prize might be or whether there's even a prize at the end of the game. We need that information, that institutional outcome, for us to do a proper risk-benefit analysis of collective action. The final point I'll make before getting to Q&A, to alleviate some of our concerns when it comes to coercive action against the Chinese, where possible, the United States should try to use coercive tools which have minimal or no market or price distorting effects. And there are coercive tools that tick that box. If there are market or price distorting effects, then it's almost certain that China's trading partners, of which we're a significant one, will suffer unintended consequences. So I put across a few sort of general principles about how to make us feel better about all of this, and I'll leave it now to you, Charles, to fire some questions at us. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for a very rich set of opening comments where I think we could zoom in almost any number of 500 different directions. So let me just start off by asking a question or two to each panelist before we go out to the audience, with the caveat that because there's been so much thrown out here, Liz, Ashley, John, Peter, if you just want to respond to any of the comments that you've heard from your fellow panelists, please feel free to take the conversation where you see fit. But Liz, you rolled this out, you rolled this report, the second of two. Peter's already told us it will be the second of three, about a month ago. I imagine, just given the case studies that you had appear in this, even if many of the policy recommendations are calibrated towards Washington's ear, that you've had a fair amount of interest overseas, not just from Australia, but elsewhere. I'd be really curious to hear what the reception, what the reaction has been to this report from foreign partners, allies, and others.
Thanks so much for that question. Actually, if I may, I'll answer your question and also respond to the comments that John just made, which I found really interesting. And they speak directly to part 3 of 3 of this research that Peter mentioned that we're kicking off now, offering some strategic concepts to the United States for how it should use its tools of economic coercion. Because we had the distinct sense when we were writing the project proposal that the United States was aggressive in its use of these tactics without a lot of strategy, so sort of flying blind, but nevertheless using them quite actively, which just this week feels like the biggest understatement, sort of what's going on here. Not a lot of clear definition. John, you were talking about the value and understanding, what the clear outcome would be for a number of allies or partners to the United States in order for them to want to engage with the United States, even if the US government was of a mind to be more multilateral in its approach or minilateral in its approach, right? But there's not a lot of definition going on in the United States of what the end state is, or rather, there are a number of different definitions in the United States of what the desired end state ought to be, just with regard to the US-China economic competition, which makes it particularly difficult to collectively for the US government articulate a particular goal then which to bring to a small batch of US partners in order to discuss what cooperation or a complementary action could be, including, for example, with regard to the barley tariff example that you're specifically talking about. That's a great example, and there are unfortunately lots that could fall into this sort of like push and pull by China to try and apply friction to the relationship the United States, that sort of already tenuous relationship that the United States has with many allies and partners. So this is just to say that I think actually we've just had a very interesting piece of feedback in John's comments from other people abroad to the report. But to generalize a bit more broadly, we've had a lot of interest along the way by fellow travelers, people who are in Europe, in Northeast and Southeast Asia, also in Australia, elsewhere, keen to observe as an analytical matter and also just as an immediate matter for policy, so for policymakers, how China is engaging economically and politically with them, sort of its economic coercion. So a really strong interest and response, particularly from Germany amongst Europeans. There's sort of, we've already touched on directly and indirectly some of the reasons why that's front and center for Germans. Also in the UK, this sort of has like a Huawei veneer, but it's actually about a lot more than that. Huawei 5G veneer, but it's about more than that. In Northeast and Southeast Asia, we've had a lot of interest, and I think there, not surprisingly to us, we hear the most sort of stark reminders to us as Americans, at least this, speaking from my experience, that there's not a lot of luxury to admire the problem, and there are very constrained choices because China in the near abroad has an enormous amount of influence on by direct economic and political relationships with countries elsewhere in Asia. And while Australia, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, just for example, have strong relationships with the United States, they nevertheless feel strong themes of abandonment and concern about where the United States is going. So this report has been of interest, but I can't say that I've heard notes of reassurance. No one is expressing to us that they feel reassured because of the laydown we've offered about the nature of this economic coercion and its intensification and its increasing significance to this bilateral relationship. It's sort of going in the wrong direction for many of the people we've talked to in all around Asia and in Europe, who are keenly observing as well.
Thanks, Liz. Over to Ashley, and I'm going to do my best to begin to work in some questions from the audience. And your audience, you're doing a great job making the questions pretty succinct here. This one goes specifically to Ashley, at least to start it. This comes from Michael Wadley, and he was curious to hear your take on how coordinated do you actually think China's use of the tools and levers that they're pulling are, or is this just such a big system that these are not as coordinated as they might appear, particularly if you're looking for those? And let me go a little bit broader even than that question, Ashley, which is, if we look at what's happening to Australia, how does that fit within what China is doing globally? Is this an anomalous case? Is this right in line? Are there new tools that they're trying out here? And then, again, sorry, I'm lumping too many questions your way, but I think a real critical question here is, when you analyze this from a Chinese perspective, what is proving effective on Beijing's read of the use of their tools? Which should we expect to see more of, and which have maybe had less effect than they had intended in the first place? Ashley, take on any of those.
Yeah, sure. So the first question on coordination, I'm just going to start off with the CCP is very opaque, and I don't claim to be somebody who like studies the intricacies of the CCP. And so I think I'm going to answer that question by not directly answering the question, by saying that even if it's not coordinated, you aren't seeing any efforts from the central government to actually dissuade to dissuade these actions, right? So like even if they aren't coordinated, they are in the end advancing Beijing's objective of creating kind of this environment of strategic ambiguity, where if you step out of line, if you don't preemptively censor yourself to things that they find sensitive, then you might face some of these actions. So I think I would turn the question around a little bit. On your second question on the effectiveness of tools of versus Australia versus the rest of the world, I don't think Australia is an isolated case. I think what you see in Australia, in which they're targeting specific sectors, is echoed throughout the rest of the world, right? So here they went after wine, they went after beef, they had barley as well. In Germany, one of their top experts is automobiles. So like this is a pattern that I think that you see a lot. I think where you might see a little bit of differentiation between Australia and the Asia Pacific region and the rest of the world is when it comes to students in tourism and the amount and the numbers, because the amount of people that travel abroad to all these different locations gives Beijing different weight when they pull the levers on some of those tools. And then your last question on effectiveness, do you mind repeating that one again?
Not at all. The question is, from Beijing's standpoint, as much as you can, while not having the direct line to Xi Jinping, which of the tools that they've been using have proven most effective, and therefore should we expect more of, and which have maybe proved counterproductive to their ends?
So I think all the tools themselves have proven effective, but I think like the most useful tool, which is not an economic tool, it's more of an information tool, is Beijing's use of its own propaganda system, in which the threat of the deployment of some of these tools have actually amplified the effects. So Beijing can threaten to pull the lever, but they don't actually have to do it. And because of their propaganda machine, both domestically and abroad, they're able to amplify this message in ways that other diplomatic messages from other countries might not necessarily be able to.
Great, thanks, Ashley. Very succinct answers. Peter, let me kind of go broad and then get narrow, and again, hand it off to you about where you want to go. So the broad part is, for those of you who are watching who haven't yet had the time to read this excellent report, and we'll flash it up on the screen at the end, highly recommend everyone goes not only to CNAS's webpage, but our webpage as well. What the team that you're watching right now laid out was a series of 3 different types of recommendations. Things that the US can do on its own, things that the US can do in multilateral institutions and with allies, and then also things that the American private sector can do. And again, I'd just be curious to hear a little bit of the methods. Why did you break it up in that way? That's pretty obvious, I think, but maybe you can tell us some of the top lines there. And I'm noting, I'm just going to, Kevin Cheney asked a particular question here about the private sector, which is, with the use of the sanctions and denials by the Department of Commerce against Chinese businesses, is that actually hurting the US businesses more than they're hurting Chinese businesses? So broad and narrow for you, Peter.
All right, can you hear me now? Thanks. So thanks, Charlie. I actually want to begin by picking up on the recommendations around allies, which also will let me bring in or react to some of John's, I thought, very interesting and very thoughtful comments. And I have to say, I should begin by saying, when I talk about recommendations to the United States about engaging allies and partners, I wish I had a positive message about what will happen, but I think the reality is, the Trump administration has not and is not going to prioritize the interests of allies and partners of the United States. I mean, I think that President Trump, himself sincerely believes his America First rhetoric. And I also think, and you see this kind of across the board, whereas past presidents going back to at least Truman have really thought about using trade agreements to strengthen allied partnerships for strategic ends. I mean, Truman, for example, you know, in the early days of negotiating the GATT, I mean, Charles, you'll appreciate this as a historian, actually overruled his own trade advisors and took a weaker, from the U.S. side perspective, a worse deal on the economics, because he really wanted to strengthen strategic alliance with the United Kingdom and the other GATT partners. That's just not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is America first. He sees trade agreements, frankly, as ways that he can extract rents from our allies and partners for the U.S. security guarantee. You see that with Japan. You see that with South Korea. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I personally think it is a terrible thing. But I think we need to be honest and should be frank about, you know, the Trump administration's approach to allies and partners, which I think is just very different from what we've seen in the past. That said, you know, as we wrote in the report, if we are going to respond effectively to China's economic coercion, the United States clearly needs to adopt a different approach that is more oriented towards allies and partners. And some of this is for kind of obvious reasons. You know, if you think about U.S. export controls, for example, the U.S. rarely has a monopoly on technology. Maybe in certain areas it has a monopoly on technology, but in many areas it doesn't have a monopoly on technology. It's competing with firms from South Korea and Israel and, you know, the Netherlands and the rest. And fundamentally, the export controls just won't be that effective if you don't have an approach that's joined by allies and partners. And that kind of brings me to the final point, which is a direct answer to the question about Huawei and ZTE. You know, the U.S. imposed export controls on Huawei pretty much exactly a year ago, maybe like 54 weeks ago in early May of last year. The export controls have clearly had some impact on Huawei. Its growth outside of its Chinese home market basically stabilized. You know, 0% growth for Huawei in Europe, very small growth in Asia ex-China, but had very strong growth in China and overall saw a 29% increase in revenues in 2019 compared to 2018. So I think, you know, not something that was all that effective. And in part that's because Huawei is able to continue sourcing chips from a variety of international companies, Taiwan, Japan, and the like. The Trump administration is now trying to turn that off. I think as the Trump administration realizes that it needs to get at, you actually want to have effective pressure here, you actually do need to get allied and partner nations on board just to have some effective impact there. So I think I'll leave it there.
Great. No questions. John, you just get to respond to everything that's now been spit your way here. And I note too that in the Q&A that we're getting online, as you might imagine, there's a ton of questions coming through, and we'll probably let John be first off the bat here on this about what is the appropriate stance of the Australian government to take. You've outlined some of the concerns, but other than accepting a passive approach to this and a defensive reaction as you have laid out, what are some of the things that the Australian government maybe is doing for our listeners, but other things that they might want to be considering as well?
Well, I suppose you can play offense, which doesn't directly poke China in the eye, or only pokes China softly in the eye. And what I mean by that is diversification is the obvious one. I mean, you have quite the extraordinary situation now where the Australian government is now urging Australian businesses effectively to diversify away from China. That essentially just means take away any or reduce the leverage that China has over us. It's not necessarily an offensive strategy, depending how you define offense and defense, but it's something that we can do which gives us more room to move on the strategic areas without suffering the economic consequences. So diversification really is the thing that we're actually doing right now. There's a much more sophisticated conversation now about supply chains moving out of China. That conversation is not as advanced in Australia as other countries because our trade with China is far more simplistic in many ways. It's buying, it's selling services or selling commodities, which is quite a straightforward transaction. It's not really about sort of making stuff in China and making stuff in 10 which has parts from 10 other countries, like United States, for example. I just want to make one point about economic coercion and what's been effective for the Chinese. It seems to me that the number one offering the Chinese give, well, I'll compare the United States and China. The United States says, if you join us, we will uphold a rules-based order, we'll repair the rules-based order for everyone. That makes competition fairer. It makes everyone compete according to in a level playing field, right? Which appeals to the higher side of our principles. The Chinese proposition is very different. It's, if you do what we want, we give you this guaranteed short-term immediate gain. It's not about whether the right to compete. We actually give you an immediate tangible gain. On the other hand, if you don't do what we want, we take away that guaranteed immediate tangible gain. For me, that's what makes Chinese coercion so effective. Whereas for the United States, asking other countries to bear costs for a principle with an unclear gain for that particular country, that's a very difficult proposition to sell. So I don't have the answer, but that's a sort of dynamic that I think the United States and allies have to get over. And by the way, it's one reason why I think Southeast Asia is so susceptible to Chinese coercion, because they want guaranteed gains and they fear guaranteed losses. And that's why China has been so successful.
I'm noting that we're kind of beginning to wind down the hour. I'm also noting that your conversation has hit many of the questions that have come in, and I'm also noting that the amount of interest popping up in this would keep everyone on for another hour or two. But finally, I'll note that it's also way past bedtime for some in Washington, so I'm just flagging that we're not going to hit all the questions. One group of questions, though, that I would like to hit, because we've gotten a slew of questions all around a similar topic, is, and Freya Zemek at the Australian Department of Industry had asked this one, but there's several others, Winston Mock, Tony Cox, who also had asked this question too. Are concerns that a US trade agreement might come at the expense of Australian economic interests justified? Now, I know we've been kind of playing with that question about coordination, about a scattershot approach, but I'm hoping when we talk about trade one and the elusive maybe to happen, maybe to never happen phase two, if any of you panelists wanted to take that question on directly.
Charles, I'll jump in very quickly and hand it off to anyone else. I think the main concern Australia has about phase one or potential phase two is that when there is an agreement between the United States and China to purchase a specific quantity of exports that is higher than what would normally occur, this runs the risk of effectively being an off-market purchase by the Chinese of American exports, right? Because it's, in a sense, is an unnatural or non-market-based purchase. And if that occurs, then the risk of prices and markets being distorted in sectors that Australia operates in is potentially high. So that's why barley is quite a concern. The risk is also heightened because in the current COVID-19 period, domestic consumption in China is not as robust as it might otherwise be. So you've got a smaller or not as large a consumption market that you would normally expect from the Chinese. And if you're substituting additional US imports into the Chinese market, then that stands to reason that potentially narrows the space that Australian exporters can operate in. So it really depends on what these additional purchases will be. 200 billion that's been agreed, 200 billion extra, really depends on what those purchases will be and whether they're effectively off-market distorting purchases.
I'm going to pause the response because I'm watching the time, and I'd like to ask a final question. And this goes directly to the CNAS team in Washington, D.C. first. And please feel free to respond to anything that's come before as well. So this comes from Joanna Chu, who's a journalist in Canada. And she asks, or states rather, that Beijing is furious today about the Canadian court's decision to reject Huawei CFO Meng's defense team's argument for her release. so her extradition hearing will continue. She also notes that Canadians Michael Kovig and Michael Spavor have been in detention for over 18 months in China. Her question here: besides economic retaliation, do the panelists think China will turn to other measures like arresting more foreign nationals in China, or more aggressive actions such as pushing foreign companies and their employees outside of China? Sorry, punishing foreign companies outside of China. Let me turn that over to CNAS if you guys want to answer that one first.
Sure. So I can take a first stab at it. I think that, you know, besides detaining foreign nationals, something else that China could do is exit bans. So you've seen China mainly deploy this against descendants or family of those who have escaped abroad and China wants back. So I think exit bans could also be something else that can be done here. And then on the second part, where on more aggressive actions, such as pushing foreign companies and their employees out of China, I think that would depend very much on the company and what sector it is in itself. China is still dependent on certain foreign companies operating within China. I'm thinking especially of the high-tech sector here. So they might target some companies in more vulnerable sectors.
Peter or Liz, would you like to weigh in on that one?
Sure. So I actually give China a fair amount of credit in how they develop their economic coercion. They've clearly learned across cases, and they've been pretty savvy when they have taken coercive economic measures in doing them in ways that minimize collateral adverse impacts and maximize their own gain. So like when they've kicked companies out of China, they've usually kicked companies out of China where there's a pretty clear domestic competitor. You know, it's like retail, right? They kicked a South Korean retail chain out of China. But there are lots of Chinese retail chains that could come in to pick up the pieces. There's actually notes they've been very, very careful about kicking out high-tech companies where they actually want the technology, you know, being developed in China. And I have to give them a certain amount of grudging credit for some of the actions they've taken there. So I think that if we do see them take more measures on detentions or that kind of thing, I think they will do so in a way that will be kind of moderated by their desire to avoid collateral costs. Which brings me to my final point, sort of related to this question. One thing that's been very interesting on the overall Chinese use of coercive economic measures, they treat the United States differently, right? This whole Huawei issue, or the whole Meng issue, is really a U.S. issue. But she's been arrested in Canada pursuant to a U.S. extradition request, and Canada's gotten all the economic retaliation, not the United States. And that's been fairly true across the board. China's been much, much more aggressive in deploying kind of direct coercive economic measures against U.S. allies and against sort of third countries that has been against the United States, which I think again reflects its assessment that so far it still needs the United States economically to a high degree, and it isn't quite yet ready to take the kinds of really aggressive measures on the U.S. that you've seen against, you know, countries like Australia, Canada, South Korea, and some of the rest of them.
Liz, let me hand it over to you for a kind of concluding thoughts before we wrap things up.
I really appreciated what Peter and Ashley had to say. I don't have much more to say beyond that, except one final thought that was also in my head I'll just offer. We have observed in the research that we've done that there's China has also been fairly disciplined in responding in domain, which goes along the lines of what Peter was just saying about based on Canada has borne the brunt of the Chinese retaliation, which is sort of indirectly actually targeting the United States. So the in domain, you know, China has targeted Canada here. Also, you know, in response to feeling pressure against Huawei, China has thought narrowly about responding in the tech sector specifically. And whereas in the United States, in the strategic community, there's a very robust conversation about gray zone warfare or multi-domain conflict, and thought about how responses can be across domain, China seems relatively more disciplined. So to the degree we're looking at additional response, it may be likely that we'll see it within domain, which is to say, unfortunately for Canada, targeting Canada further, and then sticking to the same general economic sphere.
Right. I do wish that we had another hour, but I want to let you guys go to have a drink and go to sleep. This is a robust conversation. I really recommend to everyone who's watching to make sure that you read the full report that they've put out. You can download right off their website, as well as John's report on what divergence, what decoupling, what diversification looks like at this point. Before closing, though, in addition to thanking the panelists for giving their time and really thoughtful comments here, let me make sure to thank the entire team at the U.S. Study Center who works very hard to make sure that all of this goes off without a hitch. Janine and Mara, Suze, Mari and Taylor, thank you. You make everything very easy for us, so really appreciate it. Finally, please visit the U.S. Studies website for upcoming events, publications, videos, and podcasts. And again, one more round of virtual applause, I guess, to our panelists for such thoughtful comments today. Thank you all, and good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are.